of the Congressional Black Caucus, their chairman, Barbara Lee.
At a caucus meeting with Vice President Biden, and that is that the overwhelming majority of the Congressional Black Caucus members are opposed to the current tax plan. We will have a specific proposal that we'll be presenting today that Congressman Bobby Scott, Congresswoman Donna Christensen, and our task force have been working on, and they've been putting this together over the last couple of years. So Congressman Scott and Congresswoman Christensen will speak in just a minute. However, before they come to the podium, let me say that the vast majority of CBC members are opposed to the estate tax provision and to extending the Bush-era tax cuts for the wealthiest 2% of Americans. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus want to support responsible, very clearly defined provisions, which is why we really do support extending, and we voted for this and will continue to vote for extending unemployment benefits and provisions to create jobs. We understand that there are tough choices that will need to be made next year, and we're extremely concerned that the cuts that could be made should this package pass would disproportionately hurt the poor and low-income communities and further erode the safety net. We don't want to create a situation today that will exacerbate the conditions for Americans who are already hurting. That would be unfair and would be unwise. So I would like now to ask Congressman Bobby Scott to come forward, a member of the House Budget Committee, but also who heads our task force, which has been formulating this proposal. Thank you again, Congressman Scott, for your leadership.
Thank you, Chairman Lee and Delegate Christensen. It's a pleasure to be here. Congresswoman Lee has asked me to get a consensus among members of the Congressional Black Caucus to see how we can proceed with the President's proposed tax cut compromise with the Congressional Republicans. Now, the CBC is an ideologically diverse group. There are a lot of different ideas about what we should be doing. I, for one, believe that we should let all of the tax cuts expire because I worry about the draconian spending cuts to vital programs that Congress will have to make next year. However, after speaking with my colleagues, I can tell you that an overwhelming portion of the caucus is against the President's proposal as it currently stands. Any extension of Bush-era tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans begins as just a non-starter, especially the particularly offensive estate tax. This provision costs more than $60 billion over 2 years, and yet the Republicans who support the $60 billion for the estate tax relief argue that we cannot afford $50 billion to extend the unemployment insurance or $14 billion to provide our struggling seniors who are going another year without a cost of living adjustment with a $250 check, and they even oppose the perfunctory cost of living adjustment for federal employees. We can't afford that, but we can afford apparently $60 billion for the wealthiest 2% of Americans. The Congressional Black Caucus has reached a consensus on 3 areas that we believe we can unite behind. First, we support the 13-month extension of emergency unemployment insurance benefits, but we all agree that we also ought to extend benefits for the so-called 99ers, those who are exhausting the benefits they have. Second, we would prefer we insist on guarantees that no plan will deprive Social Security of necessary revenue. We believe that the idea of a payroll tax or an equivalent payment to taxpayers, such as a tax rebate check, is a good way of getting money into the hands of hardworking Americans. And finally, if we do have to kick the proverbial can down the road on addressing the deficit and inequities in the tax code, we support a 2-year extension of the Bush-era tax cuts for the middle and low-income families, in addition to extending the enhanced provisions included in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. That's the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, and the College Scholarship Tax Credit. This will hopefully provide enough time for our recovery to truly accelerate and help communities most affected by the recession. Now, the cost of all of these proposals is approximately 1/2 of the President's proposal and will create virtually the same number of jobs. I believe that if we permanently extend any of the Bush-era tax cuts, we eventually will have to pay for those tax cuts. If you look at the Bowles-Simpson Commission recommendation, we know what $3.8 trillion in tax cuts will cost and what we have to do for that. And that's the cost of extending all of the Bush-era tax cuts. They have proposed cuts in Medicare, Social Security, elimination of the home mortgage deduction, 15 cents additional tax on gasoline, across-the-board tax cuts on everything, including a $100 billion cut in the military budget. One day we might actually get serious about dealing with the deficit, and these are the kinds of cuts that we'll have to make in order to find $3.8 trillion in deficit reduction. Just a final word, I recognize that we're in a recovery. If we adopt this plan at half the cost, we'll have a lot more resources to actually deal with job creation. And finally, we have a choice. If we're going to do a tax cut, somebody's going to eventually have to pay for it. And you can't give everybody a tax cut like it's Oprah Winfrey or Santa Claus. You get a tax cut, you get a tax cut, and eventually somebody's going to have to pay for it. We need to make all these decisions right at the same time. And what we are suggesting is we let many of these tax cuts expire and then deal with the tough choices next year.
Congresswoman Christensen.
Thank you, Chairman Lee, Bobby Scott. You know, our desire to get rid of the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest 2% of our country didn't just start now. We were never for them in the first place. Anyone who followed those tax cuts could see how they would grow, could tell that we would be where we are today. They've done more to create today's deficit than either Iraq or Afghanistan, and just as the concessions the President made to the Republicans in this week's proposal will do, they are targeted to force us to cut spending on the kind of programs our communities, African American, people of color, rural and territorial communities, and the poor need. This just gives our Republican colleagues another chance to play gotcha. If we extend the upper-end tax cuts and add that big estate tax giveaway, then when we move to fund implementation of the Affordable Care Act, there'll be no money. Gotcha. And when the 2012 election rolls around and the tax cuts are about to expire, if we don't extend them again, we the Democrats will be accused of raising taxes. Gotcha. But we're not playing that. Our communities are not going to give up their first opportunity to have equal access to health care and to have healthy communities and families. There are many health equity provisions that the Congressional Black Caucus, along with our Hispanic and Asian caucus colleagues, worked hard to include, like the Public Health Prevention Fund, community health centers, community health worker grants, community transformation grants, the Institute and NIH, and others that we're not about to let go, and we have handouts so you can see what all of them are. We're not going to give up the opportunity to improve the schools, colleges, and improve our children's educational achievements. We're not going to give up the chance at the American dream. We're not going to give up programs that would put our young people on a path to college instead of prison, or give ex-offenders a second chance they, their families, and our communities need. We're not going to let them stop our efforts for equitable treatment for the territories, and we're not going to let them block the pathways out of poverty that the Congressional Black Caucus is committed to creating. And we're not going to let this country be less than it can or must be. So let's be clear, we're not against the wealthy in our country. We represent everyone in our communities. Democrats are not waging class welfare. The best kept secret is that the so-called middle income tax cut goes to everyone on the first $250,000 of their income, including the billionaires. So I really don't know what all the belly aching is about. Several things are clear. That the Bush tax cuts have not created jobs, that more people have slipped into poverty, and the poor are worse off than ever before. What has happened and is continuing to happen is that the gap between the rich and the poor has greatly widened, and that's not only bad for those on the poor side of that equation, it's bad for all of us, and it weakens the foundation we have to put in place for our country's future. Lastly, we're not against our president. We're advocating for what he and all of us have worked for all along, ensuring that this country is strong, competitive globally, and remains the leader of the free world. That can only happen when there's equal opportunity for all who live here. It will not happen if we borrow and spend all of that money on unnecessary giveaways to those who don't need it, won't spend it, and won't create jobs with it. That's why we oppose this agreement the President has reached with the Republican leadership. We look forward, though, to working with the President and all of our colleagues to come up with a plan that is fair and equitable for all of the American people, one that stimulates the economy, creates jobs, and will stabilize and help grow our economy for the future. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Congressman Don Payne from New Jersey.
Let me just commend the chairperson of the Congressional Black Caucus and our expert on taxes, Representative Scott, our Congresswoman Christensen. And we're simply here to say that we want a fair deal. You know, there was the New Deal under Roosevelt, and then there was the Fair Deal under Truman. Every New Deal is not necessarily fair. And we see this deal as not being fair. As a matter of fact, one of the leading senators, leader of the Tea Party, only questioned how will we pay for the extended unemployment benefits, as if all of the other costs were unimportant. And so we have to really have a vision of what's going to be best for this nation. When the Bush tax cuts were enacted, at that time, that was the seventh priority of the American people. They were not asking for it. They felt they did not need it. And 10 years later, the situation is the same. Interestingly enough, I've received calls from my very diverse district, from the wealthiest part of the district, and believe it or not, they're saying that we don't need the cuts. We don't really want them because we're concerned about America. And so we have political leaders fostering a plan on people, the wealthiest, who really are not asking for it. We've had 10 years of the Bush tax cuts. We have the highest unemployment that we've had sustainable in our nation in its history, continuing, excluding the Great Depression. If the tax cuts create employment and jobs, and we've had 10 years of it, how then do we say we have to extend them? Because if it's about stimulating jobs, it's failed in this past decade. So I, once again, strongly support the Congressional Black Caucus's proposal, and we hope that the President and the administration and the Republican leadership will listen and that we can come up with a fair deal.
Thank you very much. We'll open now for a few questions. Please give us your name and your news organization.
A profanity was thrown at the president during a caucus meeting yesterday for the Democrats. That being said, is there any concern that Mr. Obama could very well lose a good chunk of his base if he actually follows through with his tax cut deal?
Well, first, let me say, we, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, don't see this as a personal issue at all. Secondly, part of what we're trying to do and why we're here today is to talk about how we fix this so that we can move forward and help turn the economy around and not create even a deeper hole in terms of deficit spending. Right here? Okay, then I'll go over here.
The Senate's already moving forward on this as if you guys sort of don't matter, not you guys, CBC, but the House in general. They're going to vote on this on Monday, possibly pass it as soon as Tuesday, Wednesday morning. Do you really think you can stop it at this point?
Let me tell you, yesterday, and you know what happened yesterday in our Democratic Caucus meeting, the majority of the Democratic Caucus sent a very strong message that we do not intend to take up this tax proposal as it has been presented. Let's go right here, and then we'll go back.
I guess when we look at this here, you feel that the president sort of, sold the House Democrats out a little bit here, and at that same token, for 3 years, the White House and the Senate have jammed the House, and particularly the House Democrats, over and over again. Is this finally the House Democrats drawing a line in the sand and say, no, not this time, finally?
Well, I leave the politics to others. We have a situation where we're making economic choices. If we let the tax cuts expire, one day we're going to have to pay for them. The Simpson-Bowles plan created $3.8 trillion in deficit reduction. Extend all the tax cuts, $3.8 trillion in deficit reduction, so we can see what it costs to pay for these tax cuts. And one of the problems and one of the reasons that Democrats have traditionally supported PAYGO is you make all these decisions at the same time. When we passed a health care plan, we said, here's a health care plan we want to pass, and here's how we're going to pay for it. And you can look, I like the plan, and okay, I'm willing to pay the taxes. The Republicans traditionally have done these sequentially. And how would you like a tax cut? And then everybody looks, I get a nice tax cut, I think I will. How would you like a prescriptive drug benefit? Well, that looks good too. You never get around to actually paying for it. That's how you got in the ditch we're in. At some point, we're going to get serious about the deficit and start making choices. And the kinds of choices are going to have to be made in this plan. And you've seen the what Simpson Bowles have done, are draconian cuts. And you've heard from others that there's programs that we have an interest in, Medicare, Social Security, education, health care, are in jeopardy if we've spent all the money without any recognition of how it's going to be paid for. I think people underestimate the size of this plan. This two-year compromise is larger. It was estimated in the Washington Post at $990 billion, 2 years. That's larger than TARP. That's larger than the stimulus package. It's actually more than the first 10-year cost of the health care plan. The health care plan was $940 billion. This is $990. At some point, someone is going to wake up and recognize that we're going to have to pay for it. Right here.
Do you see a pattern in the manner in which President Obama brokered this deal, and how does that affect the relationship between the CBC and the president moving forward?
The relationship between the CBC has been and will continue to be very strong. We are working with the president in the best interest of our country. And so we've been working on each and every issue. And I think when you look at the record, you will see that members of the CBC, we have supported 99.9% of the president's agenda. But in addition to that, we've worked with the president where there are areas that we've disagreed. He knows where there are areas that we've disagreed, and we've worked to try to reach consensus on those areas.
NBC News. If the Senate passes a version of the bill that looks a lot like the president's compromise, would the CBC be okay with being able to offer amendments when the Democrats brought that to the floor? Is that something y'all talked about in your meeting yesterday?
Well, we're going to look at what takes place and determine our strategy as this evolves. But certainly there are a variety of legislative strategies and options that we're considering. But at this point, we don't know exactly how this will play out. Here, and then we'll come back over here.
Yesterday, Mr. Clyburn talked about changing the estate tax to the House version and adding some energy tax provisions, which it looks like the Senate is planning to do. If those are the only changes that the bill comes to the House with, how would the Black Caucus vote on it?
Well, again, there has been no discussion about how these things are going to be paid for. Again, it's Oprah Winfrey and Santa Claus. Everybody gets a tax cut. How are we going to pay for it? The Republican budget, long-term budget, that was put on the floor about a year last year, included a repeal of Medicare. A slow repeal. They replace it with a voucher that doesn't keep up with medical inflation, and slowly, in 20 or 30 years, you're down to about 50% of what the Medicare actually costs. I mean, they slowly let Medicare wither on the vine. That is one way that that the Republicans, and most of the Republicans, voted for the Ryan budget. And Ryan is not some backbencher. He's going to be chairman of the Budget Committee. His budget included an effective repeal of Medicare. Now, if that's how they intend to pay for these things, then I think a lot of people might decide that they're against the tax cuts. So, I mean, you're asking these questions in the abstract. How would you like a tax cut? Without the other side of the equation, how do you propose to pay for it? And there has been no discussion, other than the Simpson-Bowles proposal, which gives you an idea of what 3.8 looks like, 3.8 trillion, what it looks like. And the $100 billion of defense spending, that's going to end up, that $100 billion is going to end up somewhere else. Because I've been here 18 years. We have never cut the defense budget. So that's another $100 billion that's got to come from somewhere else. How are we going to pay for it?
Over here. Yes, we'd like to see that, and I'm sure that the president would hear the same message that we delivered to Vice President Biden. Right here.
John Parkinson with ABC News. I'm just curious if you believe that this overall, the proposed deal from President Obama is a bad deal for African Americans, and if so, why?
Well, we've only seen half the deal. We've seen all these tax cuts that are very popular. Everybody likes a tax cut. How are they paid for? Are you gonna repeal health care, save $1 trillion? Are you going to cut back on education? How is it paid for? I mean, we're only hearing half of the proposal. Simpson-Bowles gives you an idea that to come up with $3.8 trillion, and we're on track. If the president's and the Republican presidential proposal passes, we're on track to essentially extend them all. I mean, the idea that you're going to extend them into a presidential year and then cut them off. We already established the principle that failure to extend the tax cut constitutes a tax increase. And if we can't do that, if we can't cut them off now, what is the chance we're going to be able to do it in the middle, increase taxes in the middle of a presidential congressional election? The Tea Party will be intimidating all of the Republicans into getting in line to make these things permanent, and they'll be running like Santa Claus. What are the Democrats going to do? I mean, the last presidential candidate that I remember running on a platform of increasing taxes was Walter Mondale, and that was not a successful strategy. So you're just asking half of the equation. Our concern is how they're going to be paid for, and I think you can pretty well guarantee that if we extend all these tax cuts, the estate tax, $60 billion here for 2 years there, and all these other upper income taxes, do nothing with hedge fund managers. If we let all these through, $3.8 trillion, at some point we're going to end up paying for them, and our concern is that the people paying for it are the people who can least afford it.
I think.
Right. Oh, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I do think that a major part of our objection is that we feel that it's going to be bad for African Americans. The Republicans have said, for example, on health care reform, that one of the ways they plan to attack it is by through the appropriations process, by starving the provisions. And I think this is the first step.
Right here.
Your opposition to the tax deal based on how much it will add to the deficit and the fact that it's not paid for is also something that's been echoed by a couple of conservative Republicans, even some Tea Party types like Jim DeMint. Do you feel like that despite your ideological differences, you share some common ground here?
Well, we hope we do share common ground with members of Congress, both House and Senate, who believe that $990 billion is too big of a price to pay, and that, in fact, extending middle-income tax cuts and ensuring that the state tax is not reduced, that is a way, including an expansion of unemployment insurance, is a way to begin to move forward to help turn the economy around. And so I hope that there is some bipartisan consensus with the Congressional Black Caucus on many of these issues.
Just let me say, as it's been indicated before, if you drive the debt up so high, then you're going to have people saying we can't afford traditional programs that we've had. For example, low-income heating assistance. I could see that being a target for the conservatives, saying, well, we can't afford it anymore. Section 8 housing, which already has been leveled out. I could see that being an ideal target, public housing in general. And so what we see is that, as Representative Scott said, when you find the deficit continue to grow, then there has to be cuts. And the cuts, as we see with the philosophy of the Republican Party, what they've said in the past, as a matter of fact, even in our Education and Labor Committee, when the child nutrition bill came up in the House, they voted it down. Health care for 9/11 survivors. Many of the people from my district in Newark went over to New York, voted it down. There is no compassion. And so we will see people saying, well, we just can't afford it. Red ink, cut it. We've even seen in Arizona where they're talking about and are rationing health. The governor just refuses to have certain kinds of programs funded through their Medicaid program. So this is the beginning, and we have to, the tip of the iceberg, the Congressional Black Caucus refuses to allow this to happen.
Thank you very much. Let me close now by just saying and reminding you of the fact that when President Bush took office, he had a huge surplus, which President Clinton ensured that our Treasury would hold. President Bush moved forward with very similar types of tax cuts, and what happened? Unemployment rates went up and our deficit increased. And so we don't believe that we need to go back there at this point with the same economic policies that have failed and the same economic policies that have created so much misery and so much pain and such high unemployment rates and an increase in poverty in our country. And for those reasons, we have presented our alternative, and we are standing in opposition to the president's plan. Thank you very much.